childhood trauma arises from the lack of a safe, consistent caretaker. And that when we don't have that, whether it's neglect or abuse or a combination, that we're traumatized. That we are shaped by that experience and our brains are shaped by that experience. So that what we have is a case where our brain doesn't develop in some ways and where the development is harmed in other ways, but that it's not an ideal situation, and that brain development and the emotional and social trust issues that we have goes through our whole lives. And that one of the things that's impaired is our ability to read social cues and our perception of social threat. So we tend to not be as trusting and as open. And that, as people have found now from long-term studies, the Harvard study's been going on for 75 years, I think, that really the most meaningful thing in life that helps to really work to keep us happy and have that feeling of a fulfilled, meaningful life is our social relationships are a big part of that. So it's really important to understand the effects of this trauma and to be able to heal the trauma so that we can be more open to safe relationships as an adult. Last time we talked about the impact of higher ACEs scores, the adverse childhood experience. So what I thought we could do now is just to have a look at those and for people to just chime in and say what they've noticed and what we might have personal experience with, or whether we might have just been thinking about it with other people, that so we could all kind of answer this one. For instance, addiction to drugs and porn and those kinds of things. There's an escape that happens and we're not as available to the person, plus we might be emotionally withdrawn. There might be illnesses that come because of that, like for instance food addiction with obesity. There's a myriad of things that happen with that. What do you feel would be the impact on relationships? Well, some of the things that I came up with were things about not being emotionally available if we have depression or mental illness. And if we don't feel safe, then we're not also going to be able to really have authentic connection. Without authentic, open intimacy, you can't really have a solid connection with somebody. Yeah, it's pretty huge, isn't it? The next one is talking about their survival responses of fight, flight, and freeze. We can all kind of notice what kind of an effect that would have. What I found working with people is that some people tend to direct things more out in the fight response. Other people tend to do more of the internal, just leave the scene emotionally, to dissociate or go away or find a reason to break the relationship off. The flight and the freeze kind of act out in similar ways, actually. We can have our behavior be absolutely perfect in order to avoid being noticed. And we can see this sometimes if we have children, we can see this in them too. And a lot of the times when I'm working with someone, you can really see, someone will say, my job was to keep the dishes clean or something. And I just always made sure that was done perfectly, because then nobody would abuse me. And so we have this kind of tension of, in a way, it doesn't matter what we do because it's not logical. Violence isn't logical, and it often was at a whim. So whether you're doing everything perfectly or not, you might still have the impact of the abuse. But people will try their very best to make sure that it doesn't happen and try to protect ourselves, and that there's an anxiety there that happens. These are all responses that we can have, and that we most often judge ourselves for having them and blame ourselves for having them. But really those are common, normal responses when we're in an experience where we've been traumatized, and it's more of a symptom of that we need healing. It's not a symptom that there's something basically wrong with us, that we're not a good person. It's a symptom that we've been hurt and we're not able to cope very well. A big difference between the people who go into outward directing it and the people who go internally and numb is that oftentimes things are said that cause damage in the relationships. If people go inside and are kind of numb, they tend to have calmer relationships, and maybe not all of the bridges there have been burned. Whereas the people who are going more in the fight response tend to have people that are afraid of us and people say things that are remembered forever and can't be forgotten, even if they can be forgiven. So there's a cost on any of those methods that we use, and benefits too. Like if we're in fight, then we're protected from people, because people might be afraid to come at us, and also creates these other problems too. Yeah, I think it's interesting that a lot of us didn't really have any idea how this worked. To not just have the therapist know something about it, but to actually educate myself on it and to see how it works and to really understand it, and to understand it as a mechanism that happens with everybody. And that's been a big part of many people's healing using the inquiries, is that we can really see that these are not things that are evil about us. These are patterns of defense that we used to cope when we were feeling overwhelmed or when we were being hurt. And that there's a big difference there. Core deficiency beliefs we've talked about, and so I didn't want to spend too much time on them right now, but I wanted to just go over them. So these core deficiency beliefs are beliefs about ourselves that develop when we're children generally, and when we have some kind of trauma or we're abused or neglected, there is a pretty universal internal blaming, and we're going to get into the whole area of shame in a minute. But we always think there's something wrong with me, and I'm unlovable, I'm unworthy, I'm whatever it is that we come up to explain our circumstances. The other part of the way that these have so much power is that the fear and the trauma are stored in our bodies as energy, and then we have associated memories and words around them. So the deficiency story about I'm not lovable is linked to the energy in our body, so it makes it very powerful. And that comparison and judgment have become entrenched in these beliefs, that those all go together. Well, there must be something wrong with me because other people didn't have that experience, so therefore that's my proof that there's something wrong with me. And setting an internal alert to notify you when these deficiency stories are flooding your brain is very helpful. It's a mindfulness practice. I do it with lots of different things, like if my shoulders are up around my ears, I notice that so I can relax. And also then when I'm getting some kind of a hypervigilance response in my body, I try and notice it as soon as possible so that I can tune in and go, okay, what is it that's going on? Is there danger here? Is it something old that's gotten triggered? And so when we're having any kind of negative, critical thinking about other people, or when we're having some kind of critical thoughts towards ourselves, I'm such a dummy or whatever it might be, then that's a good thing to put an alert on so that you'll notice when it comes up and you can stop and work with them. You might not be able to work with them right away, but just acknowledge that this is here. To have some compassion for the fact that we're stirred up in some way and these are coming up. And then with the inquiries, we can really delve into them and release that energy that's being stored. And we talk so much about compassion and kindness and not judging ourselves. And one of the ways that works is to really accept that, we do all of these things for a reason, number one, but there really isn't a right or a wrong way. We just have whatever it is that's coming up, and then if it's something that doesn't feel like it's really helping us or it's not very functional, we could have a look and do some healing around that, but it doesn't make us wrong. And that mindset of there's something wrong with me can be very deeply held, and it can be pretty persistent. It can take a while to kind of dislodge that. Okay, so let's just tune in for 3 or 4 minutes to the whatever it is that's coming up for us right now. And we've been looking at these slides, and we've been looking at core deficiency stories and the effects of trauma. So whatever it is that's coming up, just notice what's happening in your body right now. Tune your attention into your body. And notice that sensation all comes up in this space or really close by the space that your body is occupying right now. And I'm noticing there's a little bit of activation along the back of my neck and shoulders that wasn't there before. A bit of energy in my navel center. So we'll all be noticing whatever it is that's going on in our bodies. And notice that not only does this occur in the space of our body, but there's space all around the energy. Just pick something that you're kind of drawn to, that's something that's present right now in your body. And notice that that sensation doesn't go on forever, that that energy has a finiteness about it. It stops at some point. So if we're dealing with, the energy in our heart center, we might notice that it's not in our ears, it's not in our knees, it's in the location of our heart center. It might come right to the edges of our body or a little bit out, or it might be something much smaller. It might come up into the throat, it might stop before that. So notice the location and where the energy starts and where it stops, where it feels most intense and when it settles out. And then notice the attributes of the sensation. If it feels like it has a temperature, some energy feels hot and burning. Others are cold and dense and unmoving. Notice if it's pulsing or moving at all, if it's fiery or sharp, dull. Just notice how it feels. Might have a color, you might have an image of it. It might stop abruptly, or it might kind of drift off into space. And notice the space all around it. We're not going to do a full inquiry on that energy, but notice if there are images coming up or memories coming up. Or maybe some words. This might be a very familiar sensation to us. Or it might be something that's a little bit newer that we aren't that familiar with. And notice if the sensation feels like it's okay for it to be here, or if there's any concern about it being here. Just notice your experience right now. And take a few deep breaths. Notice even if there's sensation or energy up in the throat or the mouth, that we can actually still breathe. Notice your breath for a moment. Breathing in and then letting yourself relax as you breathe out. And then bring yourself back to the group. Open your eyes. I wanted to talk a little bit about shame. And the reason that I wanted to do that is because it's so linked to what happens around deficiency stories and around how we feel about what happened to us and how we feel about the strategies that we chose. Like, we didn't exactly choose them, but the strategies that we used and how we can turn that against us, and also how other people can turn what we do against us. And so I've been doing some research on this for a little while, and one of the things that is really clear is that shame and trauma have a lot in common. The purpose of shame, so everything that happens in our systems, every emotion, every process, all of that stuff is because it has a function. And so one of the reasons that shame is so powerful is because it's meant to be powerful, to make it memorable enough to make us change. So one of the purposes, the main purpose of shame, is to guide our behavior so that we're not shunned or ostracized out of the community. So we have a sense that there's something about us that is not going to be acceptable, and we hide it. so that we don't get kicked out. And that's on a very basic physical level. We can't survive without our people. And as a child, certainly we can't. We can't feed ourselves. We would die physically. And also as a social human being, we need the interaction with other human beings as well. So shame is meant to be a social emotion that's shared between two individuals or an individual and a community. And the problem with shame is when it gets internalized. The problem isn't when it's used appropriately. And there's probably all kinds of conversation we could get into about what that is. But that the purpose of shame is deeply wired in our nervous system. It feels life-threatening. It's felt below the diaphragm. So the old part of our system is below the diaphragm. It's in our guts, and it's in the polyvagal system, but below the diaphragm. And that when we're feeling deep shame, similar to when we're feeling deep trauma, there's certain things, processes that happen in the body. And it can be, if it's quite severe, it can have quite a freezing effect on the body. We kind of turn inwards, we kind of fold in on ourselves, we collapse in on ourselves, and we try to disappear. And the research on shaming indicates that a lot of people will use shaming to try to get someone to do what they want them to do. Parents often will shame their children. In schools, you'll see people being shamed. At work, it's pretty common, but that it really inhibits our ability to change. That shaming, whether it's us doing it to ourselves or other people doing it to us, the shaming is always perceived as a threat, and it's always counterproductive. We can't change. It just adds to how horrible we feel, and then it just makes it worse. So self-focused shame is that I am bad, and this really goes along with the core deficiency stories and belief. And when we turn into what's wrong with me, I'm so terrible, that's toxic. We can't heal from that unless we are able to somehow go into it and release that deficiency story. And so, as I was doing this research, one of the things that was so interesting for me is to see how powerful it is. And shame is the most powerful emotion that we have, and it blocks out everything else. And it's survival level. Shame is survival level. And I remember years ago reading a study that they said that people would rather die than public speak. It just feels too threatening, because what if we blow it? What if we trip on the way up to the stage? What if we say something stupid or whatever it is? And so a lot of things, if we kind of look at it through this lens of self-focused shame, we really can understand how powerful of a force this is, and hopefully hold ourselves in some kindness as we recognize that. The solution to the self-focused portion of it is that we need to kind of bring our adult self to the situation. We could look at the same situation that happened when we were younger and say, okay, what would I do now at my age with my understanding? And to look at the behavior might not have been very skillful, but that we weren't bad. We were just not skillful. And to understand too that even if we, were hard to deal with as children, or if we hurt ourselves or hurt someone else, that we were just trying desperately to make ourselves safe. And that oftentimes when we're backed in a corner like that and we don't feel like we have a good way to get out of it, we'll do things that are not helpful, that maybe even are hurting other people. The emotional flooding we've talked about, Dr. K has talked about that as well. So what's your defense mechanism when you're emotionally flooded? Is you're going to strike out and try and kill the other person because it feels like you're threatened. So all of these interactions and ways that we might do things are natural, and they're part of our survival system. Some of them aren't very functional anymore because we're not trying to get away from tigers now, we're trying to make it in society, but that we can understand all of this. And the interesting thing about something bad can happen to us, but if whoever it is that's taking care of us sympathizes and we feel safe, and they say, I'm sorry this happened to you, then we don't blame ourselves. But if the caregiver, number one, is the source of your pain and also blames you, which is pretty universal because they don't want to take the blame themselves, then that generates a self-loathing that is this self-focused shame that feels so bad. And how we shift from I'm bad to looking at the behavior. So guilt is something I did that I feel bad about, something I did that I feel was wrong. And shame feels like I'm worthless and others are judging me as defective. And when we have our own internal core beliefs of deficiency, which if you remember back in the earlier presentations, we talked about how when a child doesn't have a safe, consistent, safe environment to be in, then we project that into ourselves and we feel like there must be something wrong with us. And so here we are with the negative self-judgments, and then we are really helpless against shame because of that. So if somebody else starts to judge us about something, it lands really hard because we already have that internal self-judgment that we're not a good person. Shame in part is powerful because we construct our whole sense of self through comparison with other people. And you know, when we learn how to behave as children, for instance, we often are looking to the adults in the family. We look to see, well, am I kind? Well, I'm not as kind as that person, but I'm kinder than that person, so maybe I'm okay on that. Or am I selfish? Or whatever it is, we often, because we live in a culture and a society with other people, we compare ourselves with other people all the time. And when we combine all of these things, the negative self-judgments, the core deficiency stories, this feeling of being worthless, and then comparing ourselves and all of that kind of ickiness with other people who we don't really know so much about other people necessarily, but you know, people put on kind of their best face and they kind of pretend that's who they are. So we're comparing ourselves with this kind of internal atmosphere of judgment, and then we're comparing ourselves against somebody who isn't really showing us that same vulnerability, and then we're falling short, and that really keeps us going. So the only cure to that is to work on self-compassion and acceptance. We need to shift our perspective of it. So we need to get out of the I am bad and move more into the understanding of, I was in this situation, this is what I did. Some of it I feel was okay, and some of it I wish I'd done something different. And I'm not inherently bad because that was what happened. Anger is another self-focused emotion, but it feels better than shame. So anger can be a way that we get out of that feeling of self-loathing and the feeling of shame. One of the reasons that we have this perception around ourselves is that people are shamed because they've done things that are so bad they're not fit to be part of the human family. And one of the things that are almost universally shamed is any kind of sexual abuse. There's a few things that murder, those kinds of things that are, everybody pretty much agrees on that whoever does those should not be forgiven. We need to be protecting the human beings from people who do those things. And so when we feel shame, especially when it's linked to some kind of trauma or abuse, that also is another reason why it lands so hard, because we have this internal sense that if someone's being shamed, they're a real loser. They've done things so bad that they don't deserve to be part of the human family. And when we feel like that, we want to disappear because it feels too threatening to have someone really see us for who we are. And you know, that's one of the reasons why when we talk about this is a hero's journey and that we need a lot of courage to do this work, this is part of what we're talking about, that it's really difficult to be honest and open and say, you know, I have these feelings of jealousy, or I have, you know, whatever it is that we're sharing, but to just be honest and vulnerable, and then to have it be met by other people who are accepting of us is a powerful healing tool, and it takes a lot of courage to get there. One of the ways that they suggest can be healing around shame is to focus on emotions like gratitude and our common humanity, and to maybe feel compassion for someone else who's feeling shame. And the other is to regulate our shame response through the safe, affirming contact with another person. So whether that's here in the group, whether it's being facilitated, whether it's with a friend, you know, I was talking with somebody about is this a safe person for me to actually be vulnerable with? Dr. Brene Brown is a shame researcher, a woman from Texas actually, and she talks a lot about people have to earn the right to your secrets, that we need to be smart about who we're being vulnerable with, and that we need to do that, because we can't, we can't protect ourselves into a life. We can protect ourselves into feeling safer, but it's real human connection is necessary too. I wanted to talk about this moving shame out of our body. One of the ways that happens is that, and the very first time I was at the Kiloby Center, Scott was working with somebody and I was in the room, and this guy had a lot of anxiety and worry, and he had his head down and he was kind of staring at his hands and he was hardly breathing, and he was just kind of sitting there and he was saying my worries, and he was kind of talking really low, and Scott said, just lift your chest up, sit back against the couch for a minute and take a couple of breaths. And the guy did, and Scott says, and now just tell me what it is that you're worried about. He looked and he goes, I have no idea. He says, I have no idea. He says, it was right there, and now I can't remember what it was that I was worried about. And so he had him kind of really working with his body language and breathing. And we do a lot of that, certainly with something like yoga. We're moving into positions and moving out of them. We're stretching in different ways. At the center, I know Scott has people go into, like, if there's a feeling of, some kind of intense feeling in the heart center, for instance, he might have people kind of wrap themselves around that feeling and sit there for a bit and then open it up. So one of the things that Peter Levine and some of the people who are doing kind of really somatic body-based research is that these positions of the body are universal, and that shame and trauma have very similar positions in terms of our bodies, and that it's helpful to kind of go into them and really feel into it. What does it really feel like? And we don't have time to do that tonight, to spend time on that, but just after on your own, what does it really feel like when we feel I'm worthless, for instance, or when we get into the negative self-talk, or we get into fear? What does it really feel like in our body? And then to really kind of curl into that, but then to slowly move out into the opposite. So if even just right now people kind of open up their chests a bit and take a couple of deep breaths, it changes our emotion. And if you're sitting with your chest kind of open and you have a smile on your face, for instance, you can't really feel the shame. It just kind of disappears. And so that even if we might have a lot of work to do in terms of healing the underlying beliefs and stories, that at least we can do this. We could just kind of open up and reverse the posture of shame and take some deep breaths and stand up, move around the room. I did that emergency self-care on my YouTube channel where we were doing the shaking the tree, kind of just really shaking the energy out, and doing some breathing and different things that break the trance when we're feeling afraid or when we're feeling shame.